The moment I finished building the road, I knew it was going to cause problem. Not because I broke any rules, but because some people can't stand losing control. This road wasn't public. It wasn't HOA property. It ran entirely through my land. Land I had owned long before the HOA even existed. I built it for one reason: access. My property sat behind a small rise, and during the rainy season, getting in and out was a nightmare. So I did what any responsible owner would do. I paid for the grading, I paid for the gravel, I pulled the permits, I followed county regulations to the letter. And that's when the HOA showed up. The first letter came 3 days after construction ended. It claimed I was using HOA-adjacent infrastructure and therefore owed a $300 monthly access fee. I read it twice, thinking it had to be a mistake. The road didn't touch HOA land, it didn't connect to their private lanes. It didn't benefit anyone but me. I ignored it. The second letter wasn't as polite. This one threatened fines, late fees, and restricted access if I didn't comply. That's when I realized this wasn't about money. It was about authority. They saw something they didn't control and they couldn't handle it. One morning, I woke up to find orange cones blocking the entrance to my road. Someone had actually come onto my property and tried to shut it down. I moved the cones myself and placed them neatly on the shoulder, then installed a small camera facing the entrance. By afternoon, the HOA president showed up in a white SUV, clipboard in hand, acting like she owned the place. She told me the road created confusion and that residents might try to use it. I told her very calmly that confusion wasn't my problem and trespassing definitely wasn't allowed. She didn't like that answer. 2 days later, I got an invoice. Not a letter, an invoice. $300 due immediately, with a note saying failure to pay would result in loss of access privileges. I laughed out loud. Loss of access to what? My own land? That's when I decided I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to shut this down properly. I pulled every document I had: deeds, surveys, permits, easements. I walked the boundary lines myself and photographed every marker. I called the county to confirm again, in writing, that the road was entirely mine. Because if the HOA wanted a fight over access, they were about to learn what happens when you try to control something that was never yours. And this was only the beginning. By the end of that week, the HOA had fully convinced themselves that intimidation would work. They stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding and started acting like enforcement was inevitable. The first thing they did was send out a neighborhood-wide email claiming my road was unapproved and that anyone caught using it would be fined. That message alone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't confused. They were scared, because if residents saw someone successfully build and control their own access without HOA permission, the illusion of authority would crack. The next morning, 2 HOA board members showed up together. They didn't ask to speak with me. They walked straight onto my property like they had every right to be there. I met them halfway down the road and told them, calmly but firmly, that they were trespassing. One of them smirked and said the road crossed a shared influence zone. That phrase doesn't exist in any county code. It's something they made up. I asked them to point out the easement. They couldn't. I asked them to show me the survey. They didn't have one. Instead, they threatened to call the county. So I called the county first. Within 2 hours, a county inspector arrived. He walked the entire length of the road with me, checked the markers, reviewed my permits, and confirmed out loud that the road was fully compliant and fully private. The HOA members stood there in silence, their confidence draining by the minute. That should have ended it. It didn't. A few days later, they installed a temporary gate at the junction where my road met the public lane. They didn't notify me. They didn't have permission. They just did it. And attached to it was a laminated sign claiming HOA jurisdiction and listing access fees. That's when it crossed from harassment into liability. I documented everything. Photos, video, timestamps. I sent a formal cease and desist letter citing trespass, interference with property access, and unauthorized construction. I copied the county, the sheriff's office, and my attorney. The response from the HOA was panic disguised as arrogance. They claimed the gate was for community safety. They claimed I was being uncooperative. They even suggested my road lowered property values. What they didn't realize was that several neighbors had already started reaching out to me privately. They were tired of the fines, tired of the threats, tired of being told where they could drive and when. My road had become a symbol. One neighbor admitted the HOA had tried to charge him for parking on his own driveway. Another said they'd been fined for having guests stay overnight. And now, watching the HOA try and fail to control my land, people were paying attention. The gate came down the same night it went up, not by force, by paperwork. The county issued a written notice stating the HOA had no authority to block a private road or alter access without owner consent. Failure to comply would result in penalties. The HOA removed it before sunrise, but instead of backing off, they doubled down. They scheduled an emergency board meeting and sent me a notice demanding I attend. The tone wasn't a request, it was a command. I smiled when I read it, because by then, I wasn't just defending a road anymore. I was about to take control of access in a way they never expected. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and from the tone of the notice, it was clear they expected me to walk in alone and on the defensive. What they didn't expect was that I wouldn't be alone and I wouldn't be defensive. When I arrived, the room was already tense. Board members sat stiffly behind folding tables, papers spread out like shields. A few residents filled the chairs, quiet but watchful. The HOA president wasted no time. She opened by accusing me of creating unauthorized access routes and disrupting community order. She said my refusal to pay the $300 fee set a dangerous precedent. I let her finish. Then I stood up and calmly placed a folder on the table. Inside were county letters, survey maps, permit approvals, and a written statement from the inspector confirming that the road was entirely on my land. I also included the cease and desist notice and documentation of the unauthorized gate. One by one, I slid the copies across the table. The room went quiet. The president tried to argue that the HOA still had regulatory influence over nearby development. That's when one of the residents spoke up. Then another. People started sharing their own stories, arbitrary fines, threats, fees with no explanation. The board lost control of the meeting in real time. Someone asked a simple question that changed everything. If the HOA had no authority over his road, why are we paying them for things we own? There was no good answer. Over the next few days, the situation escalated in a way the board never saw coming. Residents started requesting copies of bylaws. They demanded financial records. They questioned easements the HOA claimed but could never prove. The board's emails turned offensive, then frantic, and then the county stepped in again. This time it wasn't an inspector. It was a formal notice warning the HOA about repeated overreach and unauthorized interference with private property. The letter stated clearly that any further attempt to restrict access to my road or any other private property could result in legal action. That was the moment. Control slipped completely. The $300 invoice was quietly withdrawn. No explanation, no apology, just gone. The HOA president stopped coming around. Board meetings were suddenly postponed, and my road remained open, untouched, and fully mine. But the real change was in the neighborhood. People started standing up. Fines were challenged, rules were questioned, and slowly, the HOA's authority shrank to what it should have been all along: limited, accountable, and answerable. I didn't set out to start a rebellion. I just wanted access to my own land. But sometimes defending what's yours forces everyone else to see the truth. And by the time the dust settled, the HOA hadn't just lost control of my road. They had lost control of access altogether. By the time the next month rolled around, the HOA barely resembled the organization that had once tried to bully me over a $300 charge. What had started as a simple dispute over a road had turned into a full exposure of how much power they had been abusing for years. The county scheduled a public hearing after receiving multiple complaints, not just from me, but from homeowners across the neighborhood. I attended quietly, sitting in the back, listening as one resident after another stepped up to the microphone. People talked about surprise fees, selective enforcement, threats, liens, and intimidation tactics that had kept them silent for years. My road wasn't the problem anymore, it was just the crack that broke the dam. When the HOA board members were asked to explain their authority over private land outside the association boundaries, their answers fell apart. They contradicted each other. They referenced bylaws that didn't apply. They claimed easements that didn't exist. The county officials didn't raise their voices or accuse anyone outright. They just asked questions, and with every question, the truth became more obvious. A week later, formal letters went out. The HOA was ordered to immediately stop all enforcement actions beyond its legally defined area. Any past fines issued outside that boundary were declared unenforceable. Residents who had paid similar fees were advised they could seek reimbursement. The board was instructed to revise its bylaws under county supervision or face dissolution. That's when the resignation started. First, the treasurer stepped down, citing personal reasons. Then the vice president followed. Finally, the HOA president, the same woman who had stood in my driveway waving a bill and threatening access restrictions, announced she was stepping away indefinitely. She never contacted me again. Not once. The gate they had installed near my road was removed quietly one morning. No notice, no announcement. Just gone. My road stayed exactly as it was, open, maintained, and legally protected. But the most surprising part came from my neighbors. People I barely knew started stopping by. Some thanked me. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner. A few admitted they had been scared. One older man told me he'd paid fees for years just to avoid trouble, even though he'd always suspected the HOA had no right to charge him. I told them the same thing every time. I didn't do anything special. I just asked questions and refused to back down. Eventually, the HOA reorganized under strict oversight. New board members were elected, fees were reduced, enforcement became transparent. And most importantly, the fear that had hovered over the neighborhood for years finally lifted. As for me, I still drive that road every day. Sometimes I take it slow, just to remind myself how something so small turned into something so important. It's just a road, gravel, dirt, a few tire marks, but it represents something bigger, proof that ownership actually means something when you're willing to defend it. The HOA never admitted they were wrong. They didn't have to. Their silence said everything. And that $300 they tried to charge me, it ended up costing them control, credibility, and the power they never should have had in the first place.